Hello, everybody. How's it going? We are so glad that you are joining us today. I'm looking at the comments here and I see a few folks that I recognize. Welcome back. For those who are brand new, we are also very glad to have you for another one of our live virtual STEM classrooms. This one is brought to you through our partnership with Yeti. They've been a partner of us for a very long time now, and we are so happy to have them on our side as they help us look out for our oceans and protect the sharks and all of the other life who lives there. So thank you all very much. We have a couple of awesome guests. You might recognize some of them if you have been tuning into these before. We have our education ambassador, Jen Cotton, who put together this presentation, and she will be leading things today. And joining her, we have Dr. Brian Franks from Jacksonville University. He's our biotelemetry expert. We'll be talking about sort of the OSearch fishing method, what OSearch does, how it differs from some of the other techniques that are out there for sampling sharks, and how we can sort of see them on the tracker. There is a comment section that it looks like many of you have found down below. If you have any questions, please take advantage of that to ask them. The more on topic the question is, the better chance we have of answering them. If it's really important, I might interrupt either Jen or Brian, whoever's talking. But please do try and just use that comment section just for questions only. And with that, Jen, since you put together this wonderful presentation, how are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you guys doing?
Good. So I think I will turn it over to you.
Perfect. So today we're going to be talking about fishing with science. So fishing is a hobby that many of you following us right now probably have, especially during quarantine. You can get out there and still go fishing. And we're going to talk about a lot of the techniques as well as, some human impact as far as the fishing industry goes and what you can do to help. We're doing things a little differently. We're actually going to start with Brian to tell us all about his research that he does and the methods that he uses to fish. Because I feel like it's a little better to introduce what he does because he does some really interesting and cool stuff. So Brian's going to go ahead and kick it off with all of his awesome information on fishing techniques.
Sure. Thanks, Jen. So first off, thanks for joining us today. As John mentioned, I'm Dr. Brian Franks, a professor at Jacksonville University. And yeah, I will enjoy talking about fishing methods and kind of what we can do and what you can do with regard to ocean conservation and fishing practices. So to kick it off, here we have kind of a diagram showing what we call a long line. There's a few different ways you can fish long lines, and these are used both by commercial fishing industries as well as scientists. This here is demonstrated as what we call a surface long line. So you can see really all a long line is a very long line that has hooks attached to what we call that main line. Now with a surface long line, as you can see, there's buoys that keep the line and keep the hooks up near the surface. And these methods are generally very good for catching pelagic species. So things like swordfish and tuna, and of course, sharks. So this is a method that a lot of shark scientists use as well. For capturing animals to put transmitters on them, for monitoring shark populations. There's also bottom long lines that are used as well. It's very similar to this, except instead of floating up at the surface, the line is actually along the seafloor. So as you can imagine, that's more for targeting what we would consider more demersal species. And that word just simply means things that are associated with the bottom. So fish like cod and even sharks that maybe are more benthic and associated with the bottom rather than pelagic or up in the ocean water. So that's really a long line. And as I said, it's very commonly used by scientists. Here we see gill nets. Gill nets are actually an interesting one. Many of them are monofilament. So you can see in this photo here, the actual net itself is a monofilament net. and it is weaved together to make kind of little diamond shapes. And it gets its name because its target is to catch fish around the gills. And this can be quite an indiscriminate fishing method, in that really anything that swims by has the potential to be tangled in it. You can mediate that a little bit with the size of the mesh or the size of the holes in the net, to potentially restrict it to specific sizes of animals, but they are relatively indiscriminate. So these have actually been banned in a lot of areas for commercial fishing, because you do get a lot of bycatch. So a lot of things that you aren't necessarily trying to catch. And because the net is designed to capture fish around the gills, it can lead to relatively high mortality. We do use these as scientists. We use these quite a lot when we're sampling for small sharks, particularly sharks in like nursery areas, nursery habitat, because they are very, very good at capturing small sharks. Now, when at least in my work, when we're using gill nets, we are constantly monitoring the net. So we have a group of people, a team of people sitting right there on the net. So if animals are caught, we can actually get them out of the net as quickly as possible. And using it in that way, it significantly reduces the amount of bycatch as well as the amount of potential incidental mortality you have. But it's very, very effective for sampling areas that are shallow and along shorelines as well.
And I think that's a really good point, because I know in a lot of coursework, the kids are taught gill nets aren't good for, the environment. So in the scientific world, they are doing it in a safe way that the organisms can, survive from it. It's not, one or the other. So I know that we've told in education and some of my trainings that these are just a no-go and they're banned and we can't use them. So it's really good to know that the science is doing it in a way that's sustainable for the fish. So that's awesome information.
Yeah, and we have to get special permits to use those nets, and they put, and they put restrictions on the use of those nets. So, we have to use them in a way that will try to allow us to use the best method for sampling that population, while also minimizing any potential harm that may be done. So yeah, but you're right. They are banned in a lot of areas for good reason, because they are quite indiscriminate and they can have high mortality rates. So the next type here, rod and reel, and we do use rod and reel. For you guys that have fished recreationally, this is probably the method that you've used, a hook and line or a rod and reel, and these are used very, very kind of across the board for many different types of species. Some of the advantages to rod and reel is you are specifically targeting one specific area or one specific species with the bait you use and how you maybe present that bait. And then you're also minimizing the total animals you can catch, because when you're fishing with rod and reel, you may be only able to have a handful of hooks in the water. Whereas if you're using a long line, you may have a long line that might have 100 hooks on it, which if you do get a fairly large catch on that long line, can sometimes be a bit difficult to work up and get those animals processed quickly. With rod and reel, you're kind of limited in terms of how many animals you can catch at any one time, but it is quite effective for capturing a specific size or a specific type of fish. For instance, with O-search, the baby white sharks, the young of year white sharks that we caught off of Montauk in Long Island, our main fishing technique with the little baby white sharks was rod and reel. They were relatively easy to catch that way. It was probably the safest way that we could capture and handle those small baby sharks. And then on the next slide, we actually see, and I'll briefly talk about a drum line. And a drum line is you can kind of think of it as a long line, except you're only using one hook. So a drum line is simply a single hook that is somehow usually attached to the bottom, or in some instances, if you're fishing in very deep water, is maybe attached to a floating buoy. And a drum line, again, is a single hook on a single rig. And we use these quite frequently in shallow waters with a big weight on the bottom, and basically, again, just a single hook attached to it with a bait on it. With O-Search, we use a modified drum line, and these have been shown to be very, very effective. One of the things that I really appreciate working with O-Search is the fishing team that O-Search has, and the experience that they've had, and how many years they have been working to improve their techniques to not only catch animals, but also catch animals in the safest way possible. So this modified drum line, it's basically a line that is anchored to the bottom. However, you have this line with buoys attached to it, and that line has a hook on the end. And the interesting thing about the O-Search modified drum line is when a shark does get hooked, and this is slightly different than how we do it now, but when a shark gets hooked, it's actually designed to have the buoys break away from the anchor. So the animal is actually, when it takes the hook, will actually break that entire kind of buoy setup, break it away from the anchor, so the animal actually has a little bit more freedom to swim around, and it reduces the amount of strain that the animal may have fighting on something that is attached to an anchor, which of course may be very difficult for them to fight against. And then of course with these buoys, we're able to actually see when an animal is hooked. And when O-Search is fishing with this modified drumline method, we maybe have anywhere from 3 to about 6 of these set out, which are constantly monitored with either our eyes or our eyes behind a pair of binoculars. So we can see immediately when an animal takes one of these, because we'll basically see the buoys begin to separate as the animal takes that hook and begins to swim away and breaks it away from the anchor. And then the fishing team can go over and collect those buoys, and they're very, very effective using circle hooks to ensure the animal gets hooked in the corner of the mouth, and using bite blockers to try and reduce the amount or the potential for hook swallowing. But these modified drum lines have been very effective, not only in capturing the animals, but capturing the animals and being able to get them under control in a relatively short period of time, and in a way that's going to give the animal as least stress as possible. And then here we have a video showing the O-Search ship. So once an animal is caught, it is kind of walked. It's almost like a walking a dog on a leash. The animal's actually brought over to the main ship, and the platform is lowered into the water. This platform is really what makes what we're able to do possible, by being able to lead the animal onto the platform and then lift that platform up, giving scientists safe and effective access to the animal. And then we're able to do all of our different sampling techniques and our tag attachments. But really, once the animal and the fishing team has really, over the years, kind of gotten very good at bringing the animals under control with as little strain or stress as possible, because we don't want the animals to be fighting for hours and hours. So we can get them to the platform, lift them up, and have the scientists conduct the research, and then release the animal as quickly as possible.
I'm curious, real quick, Dr. Franks. You talked about the long lines, you talked about the gill nets, and then you were also talking about stress on the animal. How does the O-Search technique compare to stressing out animals compared to those other two techniques that you mentioned for sampling sharks?
For sure. It does vary, and it depends on what species you're talking about and the size of the animal. The thing about long lines, and a lot of the long lining that I've done, the animal may be on that hook. And again, if you're talking about a surface long line, there's maybe 50 or 100 hooks on that line. If you're talking about a bottom long line that's anchored to the seabed, the animal may get hooked, and it may be, 2 to 3 to 4 hours before you actually can get to that animal. So that animal is fighting for a considerable period of time. And as I mentioned, with the gill nets can be can add significant stress to the animal, because they are designed to kind of capture them around the gills, which can inhibit breathing, basically being able to pass water across the gills efficiently. With the O-Search method, as I said, we're able to get these large sharks kind of under control fairly quickly. And as I said, they almost undergo what we call this learned helplessness. So you can Brett talks about, instead of fighting them, he's almost training them quickly and training them to kind of follow the boat. And once he can do that, the animals are fairly docile. They don't seem to fight very much, and we can bring them over to the platform. And then once we get them to the platform, we put a wet dark towel over their eyes, not only to keep the eyes moist, but it seems to calm them a little bit. And we get a hose of fresh flowing seawater in their mouth, and we ensure that there's water passing over the gills. And we have a veterinarian on board at all times monitoring the health of that animal. And then, as I mentioned, getting them on the platform, it's something where scientists can get safe access, but also efficient access. A lot of times when I'm working with long lines where we're bringing animals alongside the boat, that can take quite a while to not only get the animal secured alongside the boat, but then you have a team of scientists leaning over the side of the boat, which is not always the easiest way to be working up animals. So sometimes it can take a little bit longer. If the boat is getting rocked up and down, the animal can get beat up a little bit alongside the boat. With the platform, we can get the animals under control quickly, do our sampling, and then let them go as quickly as possible. So it's a very effective method, in my opinion.
And also with the drum lines as well, the animals can swim pretty freely on those, right? Like, it's usually a longer line and it's just them on there. Because I've been on many different trips targeting sharks where they just kind of swim around and around and around until you get back to that area. Mm-hmm. So it is a very safe method. We even had hammerheads on the line, and that did very well. And they are organisms that they'll stress out, and so it's a much safer method. And actually, haven't long lines come really far as well as far as the safety? And I know they've kind of come a little bit more of a long way than what they used to be, where anything hooked would just kind of not make it. But
yeah, for sure. And
yeah.
The use of circle hooks has also made a big difference as well, in terms of reducing the amount of gut hooking and things like that. And yeah, I mean, the drumline method is very effective, particularly this modified drumline where it breaks away from the anchor. So again, the animal has a lot of freedom to swim around and not have to fight as much against, say, an anchor anchored to the seabed.
Real quick, Dr. Franks, there is a good question here asked by Pierre with regards to, are any of these techniques better for catching more or less sharks in a day? How many sharks, at least on an O-search expedition, do we catch on a day versus perhaps using some of these other techniques?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, when you're talking about things like long lines where you maybe have 100 hooks in the water, yeah, you could potentially, and again, it really depends on what species you're talking about, the size of that species. When we're working in a nursery area where there may be 100 to 300 sharks in a relatively confined space, something like a gill net is going to be much more effective in terms of getting numbers of animals quickly. With these white sharks, they are not anywhere near as high of a population density in an area. So a modified drumline method works just fine. And I can only speak to my experience on board O-Search, but there are times where we've gotten anywhere from, say, 4 to 5 sharks in a day. I think maybe on some other expeditions it maybe even is more than that. But to be honest, because of the process that we use, and we're always trying to ensure as little stress as possible on the animal, we excuse me, we don't necessarily want to get too many sharks in a single day. And with other methods or other areas or other species, maybe you are trying to get more animals. So some of these other techniques may be better when you're talking about, say, a small coastal shark that is in relatively shallow water, but maybe is a higher density in that area. So what technique you were going to use is really driven by not only the species and the size of the species, but the habitat in which you're working in.
So with that, what we're going to do is going to a little bit of the citizen scientist side of things. So we always like to get you involved with us in doing this research. And we're going to talk today about, what it means to be a responsible fisherman and ways that you can help by being an ocean steward. So on the next slide, please, John. We're going to talk about responsible fishing. And then, Dr. Franks, if you'd like to throw anything in on this one as well, please feel free. So we're going to really talk about what it means to actually, be responsible fishermen. There's kind of the obvious things like follow the regulations. So only fish or keep fish during the time of year that you're allowed to keep them. Make sure you're within all the size requirements. Make sure that you are treating, the organisms with respect, and keeping your gear in a way that is safe, for the environment, which we're going to get to on the next slide. But like Dr. Franks was saying, using those circle hooks is a much better method as far as the health of the fish. It makes it so less likely to be gut hooked to where the, like a J hook would get stuck. A circle hook is designed to more kind of go out through and hook into the mouth of the fish. So it's a lot safer for them. And then, just using proper gear that's safe for these organisms is really important, and staying within those guidelines. Don't take a fish that's too small because you're going to impact reproduction levels of those fish. And those regulations are there for a reason. They're not just made up for no reason at all. So I know that they monitor a lot of fish species. Like we have red snapper off the coast of Florida that are monitored, and groupers monitored, especially sharks. That's a massive one. So just staying within all of those regulations. In your work, Dr. Franks, I know you do some redfish work, right? You do a couple of other things that aren't just sharks. So if you want to add anything with that, I think that they would really be into hearing some more about that as well.
Yes. Sorry,
Real quick, can I ask a question before it gets too far back? Because I think this is an important one. Ava asks, how does a circle hook work, and how do you remove it from a shark?
Good question. So a circle hook, it even though it's called a circle hook, it doesn't make a complete circle. But if you think about a J hook, which is literally shaped like the letter J, the point and the barb of the hook kind of stick straight up. In a circle hook, it's bent over, so the point and the barb of the hook actually kind of turn over and point towards the shank of the hook. And what that does is, when the animal takes the bait in its mouth, it makes it a little bit more difficult for the animal to swallow. But then also, because the point of the hook is kind of turned over a little bit, it's less likely to get caught on some of the soft tissue inside the mouth or the esophagus. And as the animal then struggles, sharks a lot of times, and fish also, kind of shake their head, and when they take a bait on a hook, it can be, a kind of a violent exercise. The idea with the circle hook is, as they kind of shake their head, that hook gets hooked in the corner of the mouth as the hook is starting to pull away from their mouth. And Captain Brett, I'm sure, can give you a much better explanation of how it actually works when the animal takes it into its mouth. But by kind of turning that hook point over and pointing it towards the shank, it's less likely to get hooked on some of those soft tissues, and much more likely to get pulled into the corner of the mouth, which is a more ideal place for the animal to be hooked.
And then for removing them from like a shark, yeah, a lot of times you would just cut the one side of the hook. At least that's what we do in the field. We've always cut them so that no one's kind of putting their hand in there. So it's a lot safer.
Yeah, and actually, a lot of times, with particularly some of the sharks that I've worked with, the point and the barb of the hook will actually poke through the cheek of the animal, and you can cut the tip and the barb off with a pair of bolt cutters, and then the hook slides out very easily. With a circle hook, you have to get the right angle in order to remove the hook, but it's not that difficult once you've done it a few times. You get that right angle and you can kind of pop them out.
And those aren't just for shark fishing. Those are you can buy them all different sizes. So you can use circle hooks for really everything. And if you do need to find a way, you're not quite sure what the regulations are in your area, you can always look at your local Fish and Wildlife offices. I know I'm in Florida, and Frank, you're in Georgia now, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
Yeah, we have Florida Fish and Wildlife, massive website with all the information out there, which fish you need permits for. Our sharks, shoreline shark fishing here has a lot of new regulations that rolled out last summer. So make sure that you read up on all of those before you go out there and really just educate yourself on the different species and how you should handle each of those species. Like a shark, you really don't want to be pulling them all the way out of the water if you can avoid it. Especially a lot of the species are a big no-no for that. You can get in some trouble. So make sure you read up on all of those regulations and check your local Fish and Wildlife office for sure, especially if you're going to be going saltwater. Freshwater is a little easier, but saltwater has a lot of those regulations.
And I mean, there's some very great apps that you can download to your phone that, as long as you have a cell phone signal and you catch a fish and you're not sure what species it is or what the regulations are, there's plenty of apps out there that, based on your location, will bring up the regulations and the common fish in your particular area. That I even use as well, especially when I'm fishing in an area that I'm not really familiar with the regulations.
Well, and seasonally it changes too, so it is a lot to keep up with. So that's a really good pointer for you guys to do, and they're all free apps too, so they're things that you can just download. So on the next one, we're going to look at proper disposal of your fishing gear. So this is a huge problem that I've seen. I mean, I've seen pelicans with their wing attached to their body with treble hooks, because a treble hook setup usually has more than one, and that's 3 hooks together, and they'll usually have about 3 of those on one line. So a pelican had it on one part of his wing attached to his body, and we had to call off Florida Fish and Wildlife to come out and help them. I've seen a little girl get hooked in her foot from a line that was just left behind. So it's really important to make sure that you're disposing of your fishing gear appropriately to the best of your ability. Sometimes it gets really, really stuck in there, but do the best that you can to make sure that you're disposing of these properly. And depending on where you live, you may have seen some of these things, but there's a lot of things you can do as an individual, even if you don't have the community style of disposal. So I know here we have these outdoor PVC bins that you're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen. Those are on almost every single dock I've ever been on here in Florida. So if you have any fishing line, any kind of gear that you want to dispose of, you can put them in those containers and they'll be handled properly. If you live in an area that you're like, I'm like on a lake on my own, little boat trying to fish, and you don't have one, there's a lot of ways for you to be a responsible angler, by having some of this equipment on you. So you can get these little bins like you see in the middle, and they're available at most tackle shops. And you can also just kind of create one. The mini bin on the right talks about how it's made out of a tennis ball container, really a Tupperware container, anything that you can store your gear that you are no longer using, or, even if it's a tiny little piece that you cut after tying your knots, put it into these containers to make sure that they're not going into the environment. We're going to talk about entanglement here on the next slide and why this part is so important in order for you to take that step to making sure it's all disposed of properly. So ghost gear is a term that is really starting to pick up traction. We hear about plastic all the time, and even balloons being released we hear about being an issue. But ghost gear really causes it wreaks a lot of havoc on the environment. And we have on this image, you see a shark that had some kind of, it looks like probably a rope or a fishing line that was wrapped around it. and it causes this damage. You see a ton of videos of seals and sea lions and sea turtles, whales, dolphins, anything out there that's anything in the ocean is getting wrapped up in these. Coral heads are getting, they can get broken off by ghost gear. So it's a very huge issue. So really what it is it's any fishing gear that's been left behind, either on accident, so, it fell off a ship during, some kind of an issue, people leave it behind on accident, and it's also sometimes just dumped out there, like massive nets can sometimes be dumped, so it's anything really left behind. So lines, nets, traps are a really big issue. In fact, the crab traps are really causing a lot of issues with our right whale population, and they're getting them, entangled, and the right whales aren't able to come up, and they're actually dying from that. And, there's 400 of them, last 400, trying to think of the last number I saw. It was 407, and then, it changes all the time. So, but there's not a lot of them left, and they're getting stuck in traps that are left behind. So it's a very huge issue. So by you being a responsible angler and a citizen scientist, you see it on the ground, pick it up. I've picked up fishing line so many times that I've seen on the beach left behind, including like big hooks that are buried in the sand. You start pulling on that line that's there, and big old hooks come up with it that anybody can really run across as well.
One real quick thing about traps, the other thing about traps is a lot of these traps, fish will go in or crabs will go in to take that bait. The trap gets lost. Those animals that are in that trap die and then become bait for other things to come in and get caught. And it's almost like a never-ending cycle because the things that die become bait for new things to get caught. So yeah, those lost and improperly disposed traps can be a big issue.
Mm-hmm. And they go along with that cycle. I like to use this graphic to kind of demonstrate that it'll get, might just get a whale, but that's not really the end of it. A lot of this, it's plastic. And we learned a bunch of times that plastics it doesn't go away very easily. So some of these big nets that they're just going to be there for a very, very long time. So it will take out some organisms. Once that breaks down, that net's then back release, floats back up, and we'll get another one. So there's this huge life cycle of this gear that's left behind. So it's not just getting one organism and then we're done. It can come back until, it just keeps taking out more and more organisms. So it's really important to have proper disposal and put things away appropriately. And it's important for organizations to use safe practices to make sure that they are doing their part to help, reduce this issue of ghost gear. So if you see it on the beach, or, if you can get it and it's near a rock, pick it up and get it out of that body of water. Have you guys seen any kind of nets or anything floating around, or any kind of gear that you've picked up while you're on an expedition?
Yeah, certainly. A lot of times it's ropes are a big one, ropes with buoys attached to them. I've caught fish and sharks that, have been wrapped up in things. When I lived at a research station in the Bahamas, we actually had a pet pelican that was brought to us because his wing needed to be removed because it had been wrapped up with monofilament, and over time it basically went necrotic. So yeah, I mean, on expedition, yeah, a lot of waste out there that we'll just come across, and a lot of times, yeah, it is ropes and pieces of nets and things like that.
We've seen so many birds. I can't even tell you how many birds I've seen wrapped up in this or have it attached to them in some way, shape, or form. So a lot of birds, they're sitting on top of the water floating around, and yeah, they get entangled quite a bit. So that's been a huge problem here.
There was a quick question that just came in here from Ashley. Is there any kind of a biodegradable net or gear like this, or is it more just on the anglers and whatnot to just be responsible with the equipment that they use?
My thoughts on biodegradable is it's still going to be out in the environment for any given point of time. So even if it does break down, it's still out there. So I think being responsible is kind of the most important thing there.
And I mean, the other thing, and a lot of things, not just fishing gear, but ultimately it comes down to regulations, and a big one is cost. Once you begin developing new materials, and you have fisheries that have to retrofit with those new materials, many times those new materials are more expensive than what the others may be. And a lot of times it does come down to financial decisions that are made. And it's a tough one. The turtle excluder devices on trawls were a big one, as trying to get those implemented, because they were a cost that, particularly in some developing countries, the fishermen there just weren't able to financially be able to handle retrofitting nets with turtle excluder devices. So it's a tough one. It is.
Mm. So we've created an activity for you to learn more about this. This one's more of a research-based inquiry kind of style. So a little less lab, a little more investigation and doing your own research. And on this presentation, it is linked on here for you to download. There's a whole activity that you actually do, but this is the basics of it. So there's many different types of fishing gear that you're going to look up, so you can research different types of gear and also types of nets that can be left behind. You're going to look at some issues of these specific styles. So you can look at the gear and nets and the issues that we encounter with them. You're going to look at different organisms. There's a whole list that you can choose from to look at how those specific organisms are impacted. It's not just sharks, like we were saying before. It's a whole range of organisms in the ocean that are impacted by gear that's been left behind. We're also going to look at the deep sea because, like we saw microplastics and just plastics in general, the deep sea is not spared from any of this. You're going to look at maybe some ways to help with the ghost gear problem, and then talk about solutions and look at the regulations that might be already put in place. So it's a whole wide range of research that you're going to do, from basics of the types to the solutions and the regulations that are currently in place for it. So it gives you a nice, full, comprehensive education on this topic. And with that, I think we're going to go ahead and open it up to questions.
A question that came in towards the beginning: is anybody is there any organization working to eliminate some of this ghost gear?
I know there's a lot of organizations out there trying to clean it up. So, like 4Ocean does a lot of things where they go out and do massive cleanups. Especially on here, people go around on their boats all the time to try and pick it up. I'm not familiar with specific organizations as far as creating those regulations. Dr. Franks, do you have an answer for that one?
I mean, with regard to ghost gear in particular, I'm not really aware of any. Obviously, there are some national and international agencies and governmental organizations that are working to push certain regulations, whether that is, gill net bans and those sorts of things. But as you said, you see a lot more of it on the cleanup side of things, whether that is 4Ocean or the Ocean Conservancy's, international coastal cleanups and those sorts of things, is more so what you see a lot more of. But yes, there are international and national agencies that are, trying to work towards more sustainable fishing practices.
Another good question here. It was back when we were talking about stress of the animals and stuff. And maybe, I don't know if there's an answer. I don't know the answer to this one. Why do hammerheads stress more easily than other species?
Good question. And they do. Particularly the larger ones, the great hammerheads, the scalloped and the smooth. One potential possibility is not only because they do fight quite a bit, but also hammerheads have a relatively small mouth compared to their body size, and therefore a relatively smaller buccal cavity. So one kind of leading hypothesis or theory is that they may not be able to process as much water across the gills as a species that has a larger mouth and a larger oral and buccal cavity than say a tiger shark or some other species. So when they undergo stress and they have to dump carbon dioxide more quickly, they're not quite as able to do that as much as a species that maybe has kind of that larger mouth and larger buccal cavity, is one of the kind of theories that I've heard. But they definitely do tend to stress a little bit more than others, and that lactic acid builds up a little bit quicker than other species do.
Well, we got time for two more quick questions here. You guys had some awesome questions. Thank you for leaving them. Some of them we took care of as things were going, and now I'm backtracking. If you have any other questions, now is the time. But I think we'll take two more quick ones here. I know, Dr. Franks, that this isn't your area of expertise, but maybe you've talked to Dr. Newton or one of the other scientists looking at it. To your knowledge, is there any difference in the stress levels that we're seeing in male versus female white sharks when we look at the blood work?
You're right. That's not really my expertise, and I don't believe so. But I'm not certain on that. I do think, particularly if you caught, say, a female who was heavily pregnant, that animal maybe might have more stress levels. But we've not caught a white shark that was heavily pregnant on board O-Search during the North Atlantic expeditions. But generally speaking, particularly in the immature animals, I wouldn't expect to see much of a difference between the two. Maybe once they reach maturity, and particularly if you're talking about a female who's pregnant and devoting a lot of her energy to pups, you might see a little bit of a difference. But as far as I am aware, we don't really see a big difference between the genders or sexes.
Yeah, maybe we can ask Dr. Newton. Will be on next week. Maybe we can ask her next week.
Sure.
She'll have a better answer. Interesting question here. Back when we were talking about rod reels, drum lines, what would happen if you were fishing with a rod and reel and a big shark took your bait? Has that ever happened? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure. The fishing team, I'm sure, could speak to that more so. But I mean, I've caught fairly large animals on fairly small rods and reels when I wasn't necessarily targeting those species. And really, I mean, there are some things you can do, because the big thing you worry about is my gear is not large enough for that animal, so they may break the line, or where the leader is attached to the main line, it may separate, and then the animal would be swimming off with a hook. And there are some things you can do to mediate that, particularly if you're in a small boat where you can, get in front of the animal, try and reduce the amount of fight, things like that. So, I mean, there's plenty of large fish that are taken on smaller rods and reels, and there are different techniques you can do to try to ensure that you're gonna not lose the animal. But sometimes I'm sure it does happen.
Well, and I suggest too, if you are shore-based fishing, definitely look up what you should do if you do get, like a great hammerhead on the line. That dorsal fin's pretty iconic. And if you think, catch a white shark somehow from the shore, make sure you do know what to do with those, because you shouldn't be landing them on the beach. So just make sure you read up on a lot of those regulations as far as what to do. But, large general fish, like Dr. Frank said, if you're pulling a grouper up from the bottom, you might want to learn how to vent a fish as well, to make sure that they're going back down properly. But again, it's just all education, and make sure you know how to handle if you're going to be out there with gear that can potentially get those large fish.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, I said two more questions. That would be the last question, but there was a couple more, and we can take them really fast just to make sure that we're taking people's questions who ask them, and I'll just put them both out, and you can kind of do them rapid fire. Most of the ghost gear out there, is it coming from commercial fishing, or is it more recreational fishing? And then another question is, how long could it potentially take for a net to break down? And we can take those kind of quick, but I did just want to make sure I asked them since they came in here later.
So, I mean, I think it's just a little bit of everything as far as what's out there. we, just like with plastics, I don't think we have like an inventory of exactly what's floating around. Definitely from both ends, as far as commercial and recreation. As far as the gear, the commercial probably does the most damage with those massive nets, especially if they're around reefs or get, stuck up on a reef and pop some coral heads off. That's a huge issue, as well as if the net's big enough to really entangle something like a whale. I mean, it's massive, and recreation is not going to have nets like that. But the other line that we're, using as recreation is what's entangling a lot of these, our sharks and birds and smaller species. So I think it's just kind of, there's no worse, or I don't think they're equal as far as the damage that they do. And then breaking down, I mean, it's just like plastic in a sense, where eventually it might break into smaller pieces, but they're large nets, so it takes quite a bit of time. If you think about how long it takes a water bottle to break down, we learned it's about 450 years is the estimate. So think about a large net as well. Might break down to little fibers, but then they're just putting those little fibers in the microplastic community as well. So it's a huge problem, just like plastic is.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we have made improvements, particularly with some of the commercial industry with, buoys to mark gear, because historically, there maybe was only a strobe light on that gear, and it could very easily be lost in an open ocean. With newer technologies, a lot of countries and a lot of fisheries require, GPS transponders on the buoys to try and minimize the amount of loss. But of course, it still happens. But we are trying, and there are improvements being made, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
One more last question that Brendan asked. Even if you don't live near the ocean, you can still do things that help it, right?
Of course, we've talked about, runoff quite a bit from the freshwater systems on down. So even if you're fishing, in a river somewhere in the middle of the United States, you can still do your part to be responsible and follow those regulations. All fish have reproductive needs and times of year that they need to not be fished out of the water. So, and size-wise, when they hit maturity, so you can still be responsible with keeping fish populations all over the world really healthy. And then education too. Spread the word on social media about this information. Just because you don't live next to the beach, someone might see it that does and can help make the difference as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you both very much for being here. Thank you all for your wonderful questions and for being part of this with us. Thanks to Yeti for helping us put this on this week. It's been a big week talking about all kinds of different fishing techniques. So if this is your first one, thanks for joining. And then for those of you who are here all week, thanks for sticking with us. Jen, Dr. Franks, thank you both very much for being here. And I think with that, we will sign off.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.